U.S. President Donald Trump says he's ready to go all the way on tariffs against China, escalating the U.S.-China trade conflict. Following the Helsinki summit, the Trump administration extends an invitation to Russian President Vladimir Putin to visit the White House. And China and the United Arab Emirates pledge to elevate their strategic partnership during President Xi Jinping's state visit. We'll discuss all of it. Hello, I'm Anand Naidu. This is The Heat. U.S. President Donald Trump says he's prepared to levy tariffs on all $505 billion worth of Chinese imports, calling it, quote, the right thing to do for the United States. President Trump made the comments during a television interview with the United States business channel CNBC. To date, the U.S. has imposed tariffs on $34 billion Chinese products, with Beijing reciprocating the same amount on American goods. Well, let's bring in our panel. Joining us from Beijing is Qinduo Xu. He's a senior researcher at the Pangoal Institution. Here in the studio is Afshin Molavi. He's a senior fellow with the Foreign Policy Institute at Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies. From Dallas, Merrill Matthews is a resident scholar with the Institute for Policy Innovation. And from London, David Smith is the Washington bureau chief for the British newspaper, The Guardian. Welcome to all of you to the show. Qinduo, let me start with you. Looking at this escalating trade dispute, so far the United States, as I just mentioned, have imposed tariffs on $34 billion worth of goods. Now President Trump is talking about extending that to $505 billion. Here's President Trump. Let's listen to what he had to say.
Look, I'm not doing this for
20%?
politics. I'm doing this to do the right thing for our country. We have been ripped off by China for a long time. And I told that to President Xi. I said, how did this ever happen? And you know what their answer is? Because I deal with the highest echelons of China. One of the great people of China said, there was never anybody to talk to in the United States.
So, Qinduo, is this dispute between the United States and China, this trade dispute, is it going to get a lot worse?
Well, I think, now the major content or the major issue between China and the United States has become the trade disputes. I mean, trade relationship used to be the ballast, something that stabilizes the relationship. Unfortunately, it becomes the contentious, the issue of contention #1 now between the two countries. So from the Chinese perspective, with the latest announcement by, remarks by President Trump, this is not surprising. From the Chinese perspective, the disputes will be be there, or I would say like conflicts or even frictions between China and the United States probably will go beyond the trade issue and will last for, I don't know, maybe next 10 to 20 years.
Merrill, there has been a response from the Chinese. This is China's Foreign Ministry spokesman, Hua Chunying. Let's watch.
Nothing is more harmful than chaos. As the most powerful country in the world, the U.S. policies and words on this should at least show some sense of responsibility. The U.S. policies and actions should contribute to world order and not to chaos.
So, Merrill, if we look at how this trade dispute is unfolding right now, we see prices are going to rise for U.S. consumers, they're all going to rise for Chinese consumers as well. Manufacturing costs in the United States are going to go up as well. Do you agree that this could lead to chaos?
Oh, I think so. President Trump had initially talked about $200 billion more. He now raised that to $500 billion. Some of us are hoping that's just an attempt to try to change the narrative from what's been a fairly embarrassing week in foreign policy for him. But he may be willing to go further on this. We just don't know. There's a widespread agreement, I think, in America that something needs to be done between the U.S. and China on trade policy. The president's just going about it in a very bad way. I mean, he sort of brought a whole new meaning to the notion of a bull in the china shop.
And to what extent, Merrill, is this about politics? I mean, the United States has a midterm election coming up in November. So is this about politics?
Oh, I think some of it may be. A good bit of the manufacturing sector in the U.S. likes the idea of moving forward with this, but we're also being hit with a number of news stories on a daily basis of various companies that are having to lay off people, scale back, being hit with higher prices. Even aluminum companies are being hit with this because they were importing some aluminum. So it's been something of it's a bad news day from that standpoint, and the president has realized that. He's even commented on the fact that the stock market is not doing nearly as well as it would be if he was past this trade. And one of the reasons why I think he's trying to push this quickly is to get it over before the elections so that he can move forward and say he had a victory and maybe the stock market will begin returning to a nice climb.
David, if we look at this, it's not just China that's being targeted by President Trump, it's allies like South Korea and Japan as well. They will be affected if the United States goes ahead and imposes tariffs on their car imports. Is this going to inflame tensions with United States allies as well?
Yes, because you can also include Canada and the European Union on that list, which I think means he's not singling out China in particular. This is more an instinct, a notion Donald Trump has had long predating his entry into politics. For decades, he's talked about America being ripped off, as he sees it, and exploited by foreign countries. And he certainly made that a central part of his election campaign, and it's a promise he's keeping. He's following through on it, and it's one sign of how the Republican Party has been willing to yield to Donald Trump, that we're not hearing more objections from them, because it's a party of free traders and free markets, so you'd expect some objections. And in terms of the political fallout, of course, it may well hurt him in the midterms, not least because this could be very damaging for farmers in Iowa and other states. And then the bigger picture, if it does indeed undermine the strength of the American economy, which he loves to trumpet and which has been doing well so far, then that could be terrible for him if it sort of takes away his central argument for the 2020 election.
Afshin, is the United States being ripped off, as President Trump puts it, as David Ditch mentioned a moment ago, in these trade relationships?
You know, that's the right question to ask, Anand, because this is what President Trump feels. And he's wrong. He's flat wrong. I mean, the United States, there's about 20 million jobs. This is according to the U.S. Commerce Department, that are either directly or indirectly related to foreign direct investment and exports. This notion that the United States is getting ripped off by globalization and by trade, the United States wrote the international rules of international trade in the post-World War II order. We have companies here in the United States whose market capitalizations would make them G7 economies or G20 economies. I mean, so the United States is not getting ripped off, and this obsession with trade deficits masks the much larger forces at play in the global economy and how many American companies are actually benefiting from this system of globalization that we have today. And by the way, the last point, the manufacturing jobs are not going to be, the manufacturing jobs are not going to be coming back in the age of automation as well.
Right, right. Go ahead, Merrill. You want to say something?
Yeah. Just to hit that point, if you look at the World Trade Organization's numbers, it's sort of composite of tariffs. The U.S. Trading partners are largely imposing more tariffs on us than we are on them. So when President Trump says they're hitting us harder than we are with tariffs, he's generally right about that. The way to go about addressing that is to go into negotiations and try to resolve that, as Europe, the European Union, and Japan just recently did here in the last week or so with a new trade agreement. But President Trump doesn't seem to want to do it that way. He seems to want to do it much more forcefully, and he's creating a lot of chaos with that.
Right, and David, what do you make of the fact that the president, in some instances, is invoking national security as one of the reasons why he's imposing these tariffs?
Yes, and so that's something that Canada, for one, has felt rather aggrieved about and insulted, making the point, we fought alongside the United States in the Second World War, and now this is a spurious argument to say, if there was a conflict tomorrow America would need independent control of its steel production and so on. That really does seem a stretch and a fig leaf to cite national security when I think there are other factors in play. But I think one of the points of interest, just following what your other guests were talking about, is that despite the tremendous benefits to America from trade, it certainly has been a resonant issue in recent years. There is at least the perception among millions of people that globalization has been bad for them, and you saw that not only in Donald Trump's campaign, but in the way Bernie Sanders' campaign resonated in 2016, and for example, how Barack Obama had signed up to the Trans-Pacific Partnership, but Hillary Clinton felt sufficiently cowed to say she would not join it, and Sanders rejected it, and indeed Trump pulled out. So there's clearly some sort of movement going on here.
Okay, David, I want to stay with you, but turn the corner right now to the Helsinki summit, last week's Helsinki summit. You were there, you covered it. What did that summit achieve, in your view? Was it a net gain or a net loss for the United States?
I think it'd be fair to say it was a net loss. It achieved very public humiliation for the President of the United States and a barrage of criticism, saying that this was a nadir, words banded around like disgraceful and treason, and people saying it was the weakest performance by an American president in history against a foreign adversary. I think there's still some bewilderment and puzzlement as to why the summit even happened in the first place. There are still calls to reveal what Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin talked about for 2 hours with only interpreters present. And then there was that debacle of a press conference where the American president appeared to draw moral equivalence between his own law enforcement and intelligence agencies and the word of a foreign adversary. So it was all a bit of a public relations disaster. I think the rest of the world is still trying to figure it out. But one last important point, I don't think it really damaged Donald Trump at all among his own supporters. Surveys show that Republicans actually felt it went quite well. So I don't think there'll be long-term political fallout for him domestically.
Right. Merrill, what is your view on that and what happened in Helsinki?
Well, there are a few people who will defend Donald Trump on anything he does. But on the flight back, as I understand it, his aides and counselors got around and tried to figure out how they could walk this back because it was perceived as such a disaster both from the Republican and the Democratic side. So he hurt himself. And the irony here is Donald Trump doesn't necessarily have to be a weak president. Just a few days earlier at the NATO conference, he called out Angela Merkel for her agreement with Russia on the Nord Stream pipeline and really criticized her for that, and the NATO countries for not spending more on their own defense. So he can be forceful and call a country out. It's just that when he got to Russia, he just did the opposite.
Afshin, we heard what happened at that news conference in Helsinki. He sent the foreign policy establishment here in Washington into something of an outrage after making those comments about whether he supported or whether he believed Vladimir Putin or whether he believed his intelligence agencies. He was asked about that on the CBS network here in the United States. This is what he had to say. Let's watch.
Well, I would, because he's in charge of the country, just like I consider myself to be responsible for things that happen in this country. So certainly, as the leader of a country, you would have to hold him responsible, yes.
What'd you say to him?
Very strong on the fact that we can't have meddling, we can't have any of that. Now, look, we're also living in a grown-up world. Will a strong statement, President Obama supposedly made a strong statement. Nobody heard it. What they did hear is the statement he made to Putin's very close friend, and that statement was not acceptable. Didn't get very much play, relatively speaking, but that statement was not acceptable. But I let him know we can't have this, we're not going to have it, and that's the way it's going to be.
So, Afshin, that's the president, of course, walking back what he said in Helsinki. When you watch this, when you see what happened, what do you ascribe it to? Is it just incompetence or miscommunication or what?
You know, it's a good question, Anand. It's either the strategy of a mad genius or just mad, you know, because to David's point, the base still is with him, and there is this anti-establishment sense that the vultures in Washington are circling our president, and we have to stand behind our president no matter what happens. So that might be the mad genius part, but it just might be mad as well. It could also be this. It could be something very simple, that if he admits that there was meddling in the election, he feels that delegitimizes his election victory. And so I think that at the heart of it, that's where we are with this president. But I'd like to know what was said in those 2-hour meetings, but I'm not alone. The national security establishment, the defense secretary would like to know what was said in that 2-hour meeting. Actually, that meeting hasn't percolated to the foreign policy establishment, even his national security advisors around him.
In fact, there is a move right now to get the interpreter to testify in the U.S. Congress, something that has not been done before.
Extraordinary.
Merrill, we've also had the Russian President, Vladimir Putin. He weighed in on this hysteria surrounding the summit, and this is what he had to say.
We see that there are forces in the United States that are prepared to casually sacrifice Russian-U.S. relations, to sacrifice them for their ambitions in the course of an internal political battle.
So, Merrill, has the Russian president got that right, that this is a domestic political battle, but one of the victims is going to be the relationship with Russia?
Well, it is a domestic political battle going on, and there's some dissension among the U.S. as to who is the bigger challenge for the U.S. Is it Russia or is it China? I would argue that most of the left and a good bit of moderate Republicans believe that Russia is the biggest problem and challenge for the U.S., whereas there's a growing sense among the more conservative that China is the biggest challenge for us, and we don't know where that's going to play out yet.
Shindo, I mean, this happened in Helsinki. It's a big story here in the United States. As we just heard, it's a domestic political story. But what kind of coverage did that summit get in China?
Well, people are watching. I think some people are not really understanding why there's such a fierce and a strong opposition to this summit, to this dialogue between Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin. For Chinese people, we see that, what's wrong with the dialogue? And yes, there's allegation of Russian meddling of the U.S. election in 2016. But so far, I don't think there's hard evidence, solid evidence being presented out yet. And in a sense, I think Donald Trump basically, he has his own principle of treating world leaders on the equal footing, like Kim Jong-un from North Korea and Putin from Russia. And in a sense, that is a departure from the traditional practice of the U.S. foreign policy. It's not really a bad thing. He's in a sense a disruptor of the U.S. tradition. Is that really bad? Not exactly.
It's a great point that Shindo brings up there, Afshin, and that is, I mean, we've talked to people here on the show, foreign policy people on the show, and we've asked them, what do you think of this? And they've criticized Russia and they've criticized Vladimir Putin, but almost all of them said this is the meeting that should take place.
Sure. And I've always felt that we should always talk with our adversaries, and meetings need to take place, and it's better to, as they say, jaw than war, right? So I have no problem with these kind of meetings taking place. I think the problem is that the president of the United States needs to understand that he's also not just the commander-in-chief, he's also the symbol-in-chief of the United States, and when he makes these kind of statements, particularly with a media that's really out to get him, it's going to cause this kind of consternation in Washington and elsewhere.